All right, so you're here for another deep dive. You're one of us. You really like to, understand things thoroughly, but you don't want to get lost in the weeds. Today, we are going to explore a collection of ancient literature that is packed with surprisingly modern emotions. Ovid's Heroides.
Yes, that's right. The Heroides are a set of letters written from the perspective of some really iconic women from mythology, figures you'd recognize. We're talking Penelope, Medea, Dido, Ariadne. Each one of them is pouring out her heart to an absent lover or husband. And it really is a fascinating glimpse into the inner lives of these women.
It really is. And to really kind of unpack these ancient voices, we've been looking at excerpts from a scholarly edition, which I think has been so insightful for me to read, just to get that layer of expert analysis on these letters.
Mhm.
It's not just reading the raw emotion, but understanding why these stories were told this way and what they might reveal.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so our goal in this deep dive is to unpack the complexities of Ovid's Heroides, really look at it through this informed lens of scholarly interpretation. We want to extract the core insights, the things that really jump out as speaking to the enduring power of literature to capture human emotion. How do these ancient stories help us see something about ourselves and, see it with a deeper understanding than maybe we did before?
Okay, so one of the things that has really struck me from what we've looked at so far is this constant tension in erotic desire. Almost every letter seems to be driven by this underlying conflict. Why do you think Ovid keeps coming back to this push and pull? Yeah, that is a really crucial observation. If there's one nerve that's running through the Heroides, it's this intense yearning that very rarely finds a kind of stable and fulfilling object. So these women are caught between this kind of passionate longing for love and the harsh realities of their situations. And what's really interesting is that while that gap between desire and possibility inevitably leads to a kind of frustration, what's so compelling is the way in which each woman's unique situation sort of colors that experience. It's a testament to Ovid's understanding of how individual circumstances really shape our emotional lives.
Right. It's like the same basic human longing, but it's refracted through all these different mythological prisms. And I think one of the reasons that it feels so direct is that we're experiencing it in this first person, very immediate letter form.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, what does that choice of style, that epistolary style, really bring to the work?
Yeah, so the epistolary form is really, really key here. By confining the narrative to a single voice, Ovid immerses us completely in the subjective experience of that individual. We are limited to their perceptions, their emotional fluctuations, the leaps that their imagination makes. And so it creates this really powerful sense of intimacy and immediacy, almost as if we're eavesdropping on these characters' most private thoughts and feelings. It also, in a way, makes their perspective the only one that we have, which really shapes the way that we understand their plight.
It's not just telling the story, it's letting us really feel it from the inside out at a really heightened kind of critical moment.
Exactly. And the progression of each letter often mirrors the writer's evolving emotional state as they grapple with the crisis that they're experiencing. So we witness their uncertainty, we witness their fear, sometimes even their growing resolve. And this kind of direct access to their internal turmoil is what makes the Heroides so psychologically rich. And it shows us rather than just telling us the depths of their emotional landscape.
Now, alongside this really, powerful sense of longing, I think there's also recurring shadow in these letters. This idea of death and separation as ever-present threats. What do you think that we can make of that?
You're right, those themes are strikingly prevalent. And it's quite remarkable, actually, just how many of these characters consider suicide as a very real possibility if they can't be reunited with the one that they love. And this speaks volumes, I think, about the perceived stakes of their emotional lives and the intensity of their attachments. It suggests that their love and survival are really deeply intertwined in their minds.
Yeah. And it's not just their own mortality, right? It seems like there's a really palpable fear also for the well-being of the person they're writing to.
Absolutely. So their despair at being alone is very often compounded by this gnawing anxiety of whether their lover is going to be safe, whether he's going to survive whatever trials and journeys that he's undergoing. Is he going to be able to come back home to her? And in fact, the scholar that we've been reading even highlights the fact that, love in the Heroides has been called colored by fear. And I think this prompts us to think about how vulnerability and anxiety can actually be part of these really intense emotional bonds.
Yeah. It's almost like love in this mythological world is depicted as something that is both incredibly precious and incredibly fragile. There's this ever-present apprehension about its potential loss. Now, another thing that's really prominent in the Heroid is this way that Ovid kind of weaves in all these well-known myths. How do you see him using these stories in this context?
Yeah, so this is really where Ovid's artistry shines, I think. And what's interesting is that he doesn't treat the myth as like a strict set of moral guidelines that dictate how the characters behave. They're not necessarily examples of how one should behave. Instead, his use of mythology is much more, I think, nuanced and descriptive.
So they're not like moral fables.
No, not at all. The source that we've been looking at really makes clear that the function of myth here is to describe, to summarize, and to provide a kind of recognizable framework, a paradigm that helps us understand the characters and their particular situation. So, it's almost like a shared cultural understanding that both Ovid and his original audience would had that allows them to quickly grasp the complexities of the emotional and historical backdrop.
Okay, so it's like a cultural shorthand that everyone would have understood.
Precisely. Yeah, like, for example, the myth of the Trojan War is a recurring reference point in the Heroides, and it serves as this really concise way to sum up this massive decade-long conflict that is the basic cause of separation for a lot of these couples.
Mhm.
So myth and religious narratives in the Heroides, they aren't so much driving the immediate action of the letters. They're more reflecting on events that have happened in the past or that are about to happen.
Okay, let's look at some specific letters to see how this plays out. Our scholar has highlighted the letter of Laodamia to Pertisalis. Can you kind of give us the rundown of what's at the heart of that particular situation?
Yeah, so this letter really exemplifies what our scholar calls the impossible paradox that's at the heart of their love and their circumstance. So Laodamia and Pertisalis, they're newlyweds, they're very much in love, but their happiness is interrupted when Pertisalis has to join the Greek expedition to Troy.
Bad time.
Terrible timing. And so Laodamia is caught in this really terrible bind because on the one hand, she wants her husband to be this glorious hero, so she urges him to fight bravely and win so he can come home. But on the other hand, she's completely terrified because she's aware of the oracle that predicts that the first Greek to set foot on Trojan soil is going to be killed. And this creates this really agonizing conflict within her where, her desire for his heroic glory is directly at odds with her fear for his life.
It's that classic clash between personal love and public duty. The desires of the heart versus the dictates of fate.
Now, what about the letter of Sidipe to Aconchus? That seemed to be a very different kind of dynamic.
Yeah. So this one is a really compelling example of how personal desire can actually supersede those kinds of external pressures, even those that seem to be sanctioned by divine will and, the wishes of one's parents.
Hmm.
So Sidipe is already betrothed to someone, that her father has chosen when Aconchus tricks her into reciting an oath to Diana that seems to commit her to marrying him instead.
That sounds a little bit underhanded. Yeah, a little bit. And so when Sidipe falls ill after this, Aconchus argues that she's being punished by the goddess, by Diana, for breaking her oath. But Sidipe is pretty clever, and she argues back that a valid oath requires informed consent, which she clearly didn't give. But what becomes clear over the course of the letter is that the illness isn't really a divine curse at all. It's much more likely that it's a symptom of her own increasingly complicated feelings for Aconchus.
Oh, so the sickness is much more about her own, evolving feelings than it is about an angry goddess.
Exactly. The myth of Diana's wrath basically becomes this kind of convenient tool for Aconchus to get what he wants. And initially, Sidipe uses it as a way to defend herself against his advances. But as the letter progresses, the mythical explanation kind of fades into the background, and what we see is Sidipe beginning to acknowledge her growing attraction to Aconchus. And our scholar actually points out that Aconchus's victory, so to speak, isn't because of some divine intervention. It's because he's able to actually capture Sidipe's heart.
It's a much more human resolution. It's really about this connection rather than some supernatural decree. And it highlights the power of individual will and attraction in this situation.
Yeah, I agree. And I think these two examples that we've just looked at, Laodamia's impossible dilemma and Sidipe's kind of changing desires, really nicely illustrate the diverse range of situations and the real psychological complexity that Ovid explores in the Heroides.
And yet, despite this variety, our scholar also emphasizes this unifying characteristic of irony in the letters. How does that irony play out?
Yeah. So what's ironic is that these characters, despite their longing, despite these really passionate and eloquent arguments that they're making, they're constantly being denied a stable and lasting happiness in love. There's always a catch. There's an obstacle, a tragic circumstance that prevents them from actually getting what they want.
So it's almost like he's setting up these incredibly romantic scenarios only to subvert them somehow.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, the very structures that are supposed to provide order and stability in their society, the ethical and legal norms, are often shown to be completely inadequate because they frustrate these characters' very basic human needs for fulfillment and happiness. So we see these private actions driven by these really powerful emotions that end up challenging that public morality that's supposed to keep everything in place.
So this inherent tension between what the individual desires and what society expects often leads to disappointment. Now, our source also talks about this debate among scholars about the authenticity of one particular letter, the one from Sappho to Phaon.
Yeah, so letter 15 has a slightly different history in the collection. The scholar we're reading, Henrique's story, he actually sets it apart in his edition. He puts it in an appendix because he's not totally convinced that it belongs as an integral part of the Heroides.
So is there a consensus among scholars about whether it's actually by Ovid or not?
It seems like, despite these textual issues that Derry points out, the majority of scholars do think that it is an authentic Ovidian letter. So the placement might be up for debate, but it seems that most people agree that Ovid did write it.
Good to know. Despite those lingering questions, scholars seem to agree that it is by Ovid. Now, something else that I noticed coming up in a few of these letters is this idea of secrecy, particularly in the letters of Paris, Acontius, and Hero. Is there a common thread that links their need for secrecy?
Yeah, I think in the case of Paris and Acontius, the secrecy is really tied to the kind of illicit nature of their desires and actions. So Paris, of course, is trying to run off with Helen, who's already married, and Acontius is using deception to try to bind Cydippe to him against her father's wishes.
So secrecy as a means to an end, a strategy for pursuing a love that is, in some ways, forbidden.
Exactly, yeah. But with Hero, it seems to be a little bit different. It seems to stem more from shyness and a concern about social impropriety. There might be these cultural differences between her and Leander, who's from the other side of the Hellespont. Given that marriages were often about creating alliances and that kind of thing, you could imagine that their families would not be super happy about this relationship.
So it's not so much about transgression, but about navigating social barriers and potential, disapproval from their families.
Right. And interestingly enough, it's actually Leander and Hero's nurse who really push for secrecy, while Hero herself expresses more of a willingness to be open about their love. So this kind of highlights the internal conflict that she's experiencing between her personal desires and the constraints of social norms. And this idea, this conflict between secret love and this kind of external opposition is, as our scholar points out, a really enduring one. You see it in Romeo and Juliet, you see it in West Side Story. It's a theme that keeps coming up over and over again.
It really shows you that these ancient human dramas have a way of echoing across time. Now, as we've talked about all of these letters, I think we've really seen this incredible depth of emotional experience that Ovid creates for his characters. And our source talks about this common critical observation about Ovid's understanding of human nature.
Yeah. A lot of scholars have pointed out that one of the most striking things about Ovid's writing, and definitely in the Heroides, is this really acute understanding of the human mind. He delves into the characters' internal struggles, their motivations, their hopes, their despair, and it really speaks to his profound understanding of human psychology. He's not just telling a myth, he's really dissecting these characters' inner lives.
He's peering right into the core of their experience, laying it bare for us in these letters.
Absolutely. And so I think it's this really nuanced and insightful exploration of desire, of disappointment, of the various ways in which people navigate challenging emotional landscapes, all within this really familiar framework of mythology that accounts for the heroide's enduring appeal. People are still reading it and scholars are still writing about it because it speaks to something so fundamental about what it means to be human.
Right. So in our deep dive into the Heroides, we've really gone through this central tension between what we desire in love and what's possible. We've seen how that intimate first-person narrative really helps to reveal the character's psychology at these really key moments of crisis. We've talked about those themes of death and separation that run through the letters and how they're so often intertwined with anxiety and fear. And we've looked at the way that Ovid uses mythology not as a rigid doctrine, but as a way to describe and give context to these characters' experiences. We've looked at these specific examples, Laodamia and Cydippe, to see how these themes play out. And we've also talked about the scholarly debates surrounding that letter from Sappho and this overall sense that Ovid had a very profound understanding of the human heart and that understanding is evident throughout the collection.
Yeah, and I think that looking at it through the lens of the scholarship has given us a much richer, more nuanced understanding of these really timeless human experiences.
It really has. And it leaves us with a final thought to consider.
hmm
Given these intense emotions, these raw vulnerabilities, and the longing that's expressed in these letters, what modern form of communication do you think would best capture what these women are feeling? And what would Ovid, with his keen understanding of human nature, have to say about the ways that we try to navigate love and heartbreak today? So think about it. How do these themes from the Heroides still resonate in our relationships and the stories that we tell about ourselves?
Yeah, that's a good question to ponder.
That's all the time that we have for today. Thanks for listening.